Around 1890, the people of the United States began to look forward to the 400th anniversary of the discovery of America by Christopher Columbus. To get ready for the celebrations, Congress passed a series of acts and resolutions to make funds available for an international fair. After a year of debate, Chicago won the competition to host the fair. On Michigan Avenue, there was eager talk of entertaining the world. Chicagoans wanted to prove that their city was as progressive and cultured as any other city in the world. World's fairs were the showplaces of the arts and sciences in those days before television. In London, in 1851, everything was housed in the famous Crystal Palace. This picture shows its construction from the interior. It was the first use of machine-age techniques, prefabrication, and standardized parts to create a light, airy architecture. But the most spectacular fair of the 19th century was the Paris Fair of 1889. In one sweeping upward curve, the Eiffel Tower triumphed over the forces of wind and gravity. Steel was used to build to heights never before reached by man. Americans wanted a spectacular structural symbol of their own to rival the other nations. A national committee selected the best artists in the country to plan the fair. On an early visit to Jackson Park, they lined up for this photograph. Among them were architects Daniel Burnham, George Post, and Charles McKim, painter Frank Millet, sculptor Auguste St. Gaudens, and landscape designer Henry Sargent Codman. Early in the deliberations, William LeBaron Jenney, a Chicago architect, realized that there was something beautiful here in the Midwest that should be the special feature of the fair: space. Jenney's words echoed in the drafting room. No other exposition to date has had sufficient space. We must produce space for the best effects of groupings of buildings, with foliage, drives, railroads along the lake shore, piers, terraces, and landings. Although they did not realize it at the time, this idea was an important step in the history of American architecture. The individual buildings would be subordinate to a larger design where space was supreme. This sketch shows the three main spaces to be developed. In the lower right, there is an area called the court, later the Court of Honor, a reflecting pool surrounded by formal buildings. In the center, a wooded island, an informal place to rest, filled with wandering paths, trees, and flowers. To the upper left, the midway, 10 fun-filled blocks of restaurants, dance halls, and other amusements. This would also be the site of Chicago's answer to the Eiffel Tower, the Ferris wheel. The unlabeled rectangles indicate the location of the principal buildings, places for scientific and artistic exhibitions, and the pavilions of the states and nations. The emphasis on space was apparent in this early projection. Daniel Burnham was selected Chief of Construction. It was his job to make this vision a reality. He set up temporary headquarters in Jackson Park and hired 14,000 men. They lived in tents, commuted by the Illinois Central, or lived in houseboats. The biggest problem was the location. It was a dismal swamp. It had to be completely dredged. After the clearance, the land was not above the level of the lake at high water, so it had to be built up 6.5 feet. It took 400,000 cubic yards of earth. Pontoon bridges were erected and tracks laid to carry the structural materials: lumber for the floors, superstructures, and the scaffolds to hold the exterior wall panels. 30,000 tons of hemp and plaster, or staff, a deliberately temporary material, were mixed, molded, and nailed to the superstructures. Was all transformed to sparkling white by the latest spray painting invention. The workmen boasted that the Manufacturers and Liberal Arts Building was the largest roofed building in history. A ground plan of the times proved that you could put the U.S. Capitol, the Great Pyramid of Egypt, Winchester Cathedral, Madison Square Garden, and St. Paul's Cathedral all on the floor of the great building. But its modern construction method was the pride of American engineers. The building was a series of arches, each with 3 hinges. 2 hinges were at the ends of each arch, so that the arches were not rigidly encased in the foundations, but left free to move. Half of the hinge was in the ground, the joint was at ground level, and the other half of the hinge was above ground level. The 3rd hinge at the top completed the system. Instead of having to resist the wind by sheer bulk of wall, like old-fashioned masonry buildings, this 3-hinged arch building moved with the wind, and it was more elegant than its Parisian predecessor at the World's Fair of 1889. Machinery Hall also used modern metal for its arches, and so did Horticulture Hall. Its dome made a perfect greenhouse for the plants below. It was form and function fused. But most of the architects used the metal structures or wooden scaffoldings to hold ornamental or traditional facades. The most celebrated were Louis Sullivan's Transportation Building and Charles Atwood's Fine Arts Building. This is the only building left from the fair. It now houses the Chicago Museum of Science and Industry. The exhibition in Electricity Hall promised a magical excitement. There were to be displays of the newest inventions in dynamos, or generators, and the latest developments in the wonders of arc lights, incandescent lights, and colored floodlights. For the first time, the science of electricity would be used as an architectural medium. As the time for the opening approached, a flurry of final preparations ensued. The 70-ton axle for the Ferris wheel was put in place on the midway. The movable sidewalk on the landing pier was tested. The large conveyor belt holding the benches moved along without a hitch. The sculpture was put in place. The buildings got a final dusting off from the fireboats, and the local citizens braced themselves. As one cartoonist saw it, they would have to line their living room walls with Pullman berths to get ready for the summer deluge of visiting relatives. At noon, on May 1st, 1893, President Cleveland pushed the button to start the festivities. Soon visitors from all over the world began to arrive. Everyone wanted to go on the Ferris wheel. It soared over the midway, a perfect pinion wheel, a lofty triumph, and it was better than the Eiffel Tower because it moved. It rose 250 feet with 36 cars, each holding 40 passengers, and it moved with the precision of a fine watch. From the Ferris wheel, the visitor could walk to enjoy block after block of miniature scenes of other countries and other times. Outdoor cafes, old world bazaars, and daily parades, this one on Cairo Street in Egyptian Village. Leaving the Midway, and walking towards the northern boundaries of the fair, the visitors look forward to the excursion boats. They waited to take people through the spaces created by the artists. And what lovely spaces they were. The lagoons reflected the blue sky and white clouds. Trees lined every path. Pocket parks surrounded even small buildings. The aisles and the lagoons united buildings and foliage. There were Japanese irises, weeping willows, and aquatic plants. The buildings were mirrors of light and color. On the wooded island, the visitor became a part of the romantic landscape. The buildings serve a double function here. They define the horizon and invite the visitor to come closer. The administration building, brilliant in the sunlight, was at the west end of the Court of Honor. Machinery Hall, on the left, was on the South Lagoon, but the climax was in the east. The peristyle in the back and the buildings on the sides were the setting for the real triumph of the Chicago Fair. The visitor was compelled to step back. Here was a new attitude towards architecture. The individual buildings were subordinate to a larger design. Space was supreme. As twilight descended, the changing hours wrought their own special wonders. Lights were lit on the terraces. Architecture and science had made it all possible. It was the wedding of space and light. It was the promise of a new dawn in architecture. Henry Adams said, it was a step in evolution.